Hello interwebs, so here I am about to embark on my journey to a brand new city from Los Angeles to Seattle for my brand new job, a risk that I am only able to take because of all of you, so thank you for that. But I am honestly very excited and ready to be hitting the road and getting out of Los Angeles finally. I've got my giant ass U-Haul with everything I own on this truck, including my car, which is strapped to a tow dolly. That was a whole thing to deal with. And I've got my cat Newt right over there. Say hello to the nice YouTube audience. Hey, buddy. I know, it's a long trip, but we'll get there soon, all right? It's gonna be a long road getting from here to there. It's been a long road. But in order for me to finally get to Seattle, I've got to engage in one of those noblest of American traditions, the road trip. Something that I have honestly always enjoyed. I mean, think about it. That idea of the open road ahead of you, miles and miles of highway and new terrain as it rolls by you, and you get to see all these different biomes like you're going through Minecraft. God, I'm a millennial nerd. But there's this romanticization around the whole idea of just traveling down the road. And you know, that got me thinking, and you know what happens when I think about stuff?
I must monetize it for YouTube.
But more realistically though, I have to dive into why the road trip captures our imagination, and specifically American ideals and imagination, because the road trip is so expressly tied with Americana in popular culture. And for me, it really goes to the heart of American ideals, and also makes me question who has access to those very ideas of mobility and expansion. But before we get to that, let's actually hit the road and not hit this car right here, and we are officially off on an adventure, everybody. So let's go on the road and talk about the ideals of America and road trips. On the road again, just can't wait till I don't know the words. I'm just gonna sing this song and hope it sounds good to you, and I can't wait to get on the road again. Beautiful. I'm a great singer. Now, obviously road trips are not a uniquely American idea. In fact, the first ever road trip was done by a German woman, girl power, named Bertha Benz, wife of Karl Benz, the founder of Benz Motorwagen, when she took her husband's experimental automobile for a 66-mile test drive as a publicity stunt. Well, either a publicity stunt or she just really wanted to get out of the house. You don't own me. But since then, while certainly other countries definitely go on road trips have been uniquely tied with American culture. There are some obvious reasons why. I mean, America is pretty darn big, so road trips are much more of a necessity than, say, in other places like the United Kingdom, where you can drive across the whole dang country in a single day or so. Yet there's also a bit more to it. In America, mobility has always been synonymous with progress and American exceptionalism. So I've currently stopped in the city of Weed. Yeah, literally like weed, W-E-E-D, which is kind of hilarious, but I feel like they get that joke all the time, but I also see a ton of weed stores in this town. So at least they're kind of like in on the joke a little bit, but I at least wanted to let you all know that I got gas, and it was in a place called Weed, which I think is great. It's absolutely hilarious. But back to the idea of mobility and American exceptionalism, let's talk about the idea of manifest destiny. American journalist John L. O'Sullivan first coined the term manifest destiny in 1845 when he wrote, quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny, to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given to us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us." I don't know why a guy named John L. O'Sullivan has that accent in my mind, but I'm just going to assume everyone born before the 1900s in America just has that voice. Basically, though, manifest destiny was the idea that Americans had the divine right to control the whole North American continent, from sea to shining sea, they might say, so that we might expand our ideas of equality, rights of consciousness, and personal enfranchisement, quote, "to establish on earth the moral dignity and salvation of man."
Basically, America is just so damn good, we have a right to own everything. America! Fuck yeah! Yeah, America, we're great. But despite how that message may come across as, you know, the seeds of nationalism, which has caused a few issues here in America over the last few years and decades and centuries, but this concept at the time captured the hearts of many, and the idea of moving west became part of the American dream, that we were expanding our ideals outward into the rest of the continent, to push forward, to progress the idea of the country. It's why you saw so many people hitting that there Oregon Trail, unless, you know, they were dying of dysentery like I always did in that game. Though I guess I am in Oregon. I'm actually in Oregon right now, so I guess, you know, I won in the end. Didn't die of dysentery this time. But this idea of progress and moral certitude became tied in with the idea of physical movement. American progress then became linked with metaphors of movement. Yet once America could no longer expand further west, those ideals of American exceptionalism and progress became combined with another symbol of mobility in America, the automobile. Henry Ford and his assembly line became synonymous with American ingenuity and intelligence, as well as overworking of the labor force, but that's a different point, as well as capitalistic drive. And suddenly, the symbol of the car again became linked with progress. At the end of World War II, car ownership skyrocketed, and 1 in 6 Americans were employed by the automobile industry. Cars and the road became intrinsically linked with American culture, yet also tied with one's own individual prosperity. To own a car gave you a certain status. It meant that you were cool and that you had a certain social or economic place in the country. You obviously had money if you owned a car, and you were pretty dang cool if you could get around. Mobility not only became tied with American progress, but one's own individual and personal progress as well.
So America's belief in its own self-worth, both as a country with moral standing in freedom and prosperity, as well as an individual's ability to provide for himself or herself or themselves economically and socially, all became wrapped up around this idea to move oneself. And even this idea of mobility gets extrapolated out into how Americans see the future.
I mean, let's look at Star Trek. I know, you thought you were going to get through a Jesse Gender video without talking about Star Trek. You naive sucker. But let's discuss how Starfleet and the Federation, which we've talked about in other videos are just idealistic representations of American ideals, think of as a benchmark for progress. Starfleet's prime directive is a rule that says it can't interfere with, quote, less developed or primitive cultures. But less developed and primitive cultures is a pretty nebulous definition. What is that arbitrary line in the sand for if a society is primitive or not in Starfleet's eyes? Well, for them, it's if they've developed faster than light travel, aka warp drive. If the culture and people are able to zip across the galaxy.
By their own account, they left Earth in 2053. They did not use a starship. That makes them pre-warp, subject to General Order 1. We cannot interfere with their natural development.
But why is that the standard for progress? It could have easily just as been something like a development of a worldwide communication system or the creation of one global world government. In fact, I would personally consider that last one, the ability for a civilization to work together in peace and harmony instead of individualistic nation-states, to be a better benchmark that a society is advanced enough to warrant contact with other cultures than something as arbitrary as the development of warp drive. I mean, think of how many episodes of Star Trek revolve around different cultures of the same planet fighting with each other even though they've still developed warp drive. And also think about how Starfleet and the Federation can only exist because humanity got its crap together and formed a single world government. It seems to me that the development of fast and light travel isn't really a good determination of if a culture is mature enough in order to partake with the rest of the galaxy. But no, the benchmark for quote-unquote primitive cultures is warp drive to Starfleet. And even the whole concept of Star Trek was pitched as the wagon train to the stars, a science fiction version of the Western, a genre which itself is steeped in those ideals of Western expansion and manifest destiny that we talked about earlier.
So I'm currently at that point in the road trip where my butt really hurts. I've been sitting for hours, but I still have like several hours ahead of me, so I'm like, oh my god, my butt will not survive. My butt will not survive this road trip, but we power through. I'm a power bottom. I didn't think this part of the video out.
So much of American pop culture and general ideals are based around one's ability to move oneself from place to place, like I'm doing now. And so putting limits onto one's ability to move reveals a lot about who America values, which we can clearly see when we look at minorities throughout American history. Black mobility, for example, has long been a source of white anxiety in the United States. For example, the Fugitive Slave Act was a law that required slaves to be returned to their owners, even if they were found in free states. So even if a black person managed to escape the hell that was slavery, they could quickly be returned if they were captured, no matter where they were in the US. Later on, this same idea got wrapped up in the idea of the automobile. As graduate student Emily K. Carrion stated in her essay for Stanford University, quote, "For black motorists, cars were at once a source of humiliation and a desired commodity. Traveling by car often meant facing unwanted attention and acts of terrorism from white drivers and law enforcement. Jim Crow laws restricted African American travelers' accesses to hotels, restaurants, roadside services, and restrooms. Such laws were inconsistently enforced, meaning the threat of being denied access was ever present. Yet, cars also offered African Americans a rare taste of the good life. Owning a car meant participating and belonging in mainstream consumer culture. But obviously, due to numerous systemic and direct interventions focused on the black community's ability to access economic mobility, access to cars and modes of transportation was continually limited. Yet, despite this, the American dream was wrapped up in the idea of the road trip, something we spoke about in my video on Lovecraft Country. Look at the works of the painter Edward Hopper, who is often credited with capturing the soul and spirit of America in his beautiful oil paintings, yet there are never any black people that appear in these oil paintings. In the first episode of Lovecraft Country, as I talked about in my video on that show, Atticus and Letty, the two main characters, often stop at places that look like they are right out of an Edward Hopper painting. Yet they don't get to fully enjoy that open road experience that every other white American would get to have. At one point in the episode, they're kicked out by young white Americans disgustingly insulting them like monkeys, as if Atticus and Letty were beasts. It's for this exact reason, and for many worse ones, that many black Americans relied on things like the Green Book, a famous guidebook for black travelers who hoped to have access to that American dream of driving across the country, but needed to know where they would be safe. The Green Book told them what places were friendly to black people and which to avoid. African American travelers also faced hardships such as white-owned businesses refusing to serve them or repair their vehicles, being refused accommodations or food by white-owned hotels, and threats of physical violence and forcible expulsion from white-only sundown towns where if a black man or woman was found after sundown, it was perfectly legal for them to be killed. We also see mobility work the other way in terms of fleeing from minority groups, as we saw with things like white flight, where white Americans moved, again, mobility, out of cities to the suburbs once black Americans started to move into urban neighborhoods, thus preventing the integration of these two communities.
And consequently, when you have the black people moving into your neighborhood, it suddenly, the bottom drops out. I mean, if these people can move in, then obviously your neighborhood is no longer what you thought it was. It's no longer really very valuable to you.
Yet many black Americans were unable to move to the suburbs themselves because they were economically unable to. And this economic inequality still exists today, as well as the stoking of the fears of white Americans feeling like these scary black people would be coming into their suburban communities.
And by the way, I just ended the rule on suburbs. The suburbs, people fight all of their lives to get into the suburbs and have a beautiful home. There will be no more low-income housing forced into the suburbs. I abandoned and took away and just rescinded the rule. It's been going on for years. I've seen conflict for years. It's been hell for suburbia. We rescinded the rule 3 days ago, so enjoy your life, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your life.
But people of color aren't the only ones whose mobility is limited within America. As many of you know, I'm transgender, a member of the LGBTQ community, and I have to think every time I travel across the United States because I am transgender. While I'm luckily traveling up the West Coast right now through California, Oregon, and Washington, 3 states I know to have trans-affirming laws on the books, if I was traveling even further cross-country, I'd have to be careful to be aware of the laws about trans people and bathrooms in every state I traveled through. If I entered, quote, the wrong bathroom because I'm trans in a state, I could face fines or prison time.
The reality is that bathrooms have long been a battleground, and we saw this in the context of the civil rights movement and efforts to expel black people from spaces that white people dominated, including bathrooms and locker rooms.
Wait, what are you doing in the women's bathroom?
If I was in North Carolina, I would have to use the women's bathroom because I was assigned female at birth. So I would be a dude in the women's bathroom.
As Vox's video points out, a lot of the same tactics are used against multiple minority groups across America. Many of the same things that LGBTQ Americans face are elements of the same things that Black Americans face. For example, LGBTQ Americans even had their own version of the Green Book. Now, there's also a difference of scale and ramifications for each, but the same basic tactics are being used to limit the mobility of minority groups in America. Similarly, in that same vein, like many Black Americans who could face violence while traveling across the country, trans people and LGBTQ people could also face violence while traveling.
So, for example, let me share with you all a little bit of something that I'm currently processing and going through and have to deal with as a trans person on the road. Right now, I'm in a stretch of road where I'm going through a ton of farmland. It's been about 100 miles of a lot of farmland. I'm sure there's many, many more miles of farmland ahead of me. But also, I'm looking at my gas right now, and in the near-ish future, I'm gonna have to stop, get out of my U-Haul, and get gas. Because I'm just gonna need to fill it up. That's part of the road trip experience that everyone has to do. You always have to stop somewhere and get some gas. But the problem that I'm currently facing is, as I go through this long stretch of farmland, of nothingness, where there's not a lot of big cities and a lot of people around, is I've seen a lot of signs of farmers for Trump. Like a lot of Trump signs. And we'll kind of set aside some of the larger Trump talk for now. In fact, this video may even be going up after the election, depending on when I'm able to edit it. But with a little bit of overgeneralization, I do know that as a queer person, there is a lot more chance of anti-LGBTQ sentiment and hate within more conservative areas. So seeing all those Trump signs makes me uncomfortable. Not just the political aspects of it, of which I have many thoughts, but just the idea of I have to stop, get out of my car. I am all by myself with my cat, and as much as Newt, you know, I'm sure would do all of he could to protect me, I'm by myself. And while I'm sure I would be fine stopping at a gas station on the side of the road, I'm sure no one would have a problem with anything, I am visibly trans. And so there's an element of risk and danger that I put myself in when I stop at a sort of lowly gas station in a conservative area that I know has a greater propensity for anti-LGBTQ hate. There's a chance I could get really hurt by someone who hates trans people or has a thing against trans people because I'm by myself in the middle of this area and look visibly trans. That's something I have to think about and take into account as I travel across the country as a trans person in this area. Now I'm going to try and stop at a more populated area. In fact, there's a Trump sign right there. I don't think you might not see it in the video, but I just passed one right there. But it's just something I have to be cognizant of, that other people who are not trans don't have to think about it. They can just stop wherever they want and they'll probably be safe and not have to really take that into account. So my mobility, my ability to access certain spaces in this great American road trip is limited because of that, because of who I am and my identity.
77% of LGBTQ people have experienced some form of harassment while traveling in the United States. It's something I have to keep into account while traveling, as do many Black Americans and members of other minorities when traveling through states and areas more known for high incidence of hate crimes. Yet while America typically limits the mobility of those it values less, it also has forced minority groups to move at the behest of white Americans. Think again about that idea of manifest destiny, where Americans were moving out west. Well, there were already people there. Many indigenous folks were continually pushed further and further out of their ancestral territories as Americans moved west, and were often vilified and killed by American citizens. This all culminated in the 1830s, where President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the forceful relocation of 60,000 indigenous folks, in what infamously became known as the Trail of Tears, where indigenous people suffer from exposure, disease, and starvation as they were put onto reservations, where again, their mobility was limited and restricted.
This split apart a unified people who had chosen to live together for centuries, organizing themselves around a sophisticated common law with a capital and recognized regions and all 7 family clans represented in every town. This was a people that wanted to live together, who had, as Augustine said, loved things held in common, and they were sundered apart by coercion. Now, the Cherokees are found in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the Eastern Band of Cherokees in North Carolina, and in various other communities across the United States and even Mexico. No longer the coherent nation they had been.
So it's not just a lack of mobility, but the ability to choose where and how you move that links the idea of movement with America's devaluation of minority groups. And we've seen this throughout American history, such as with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to today with the Trump administration's placement of numerous Hispanic people in cages at the border. So, what have we learned from all of this? Well, first off, don't plan to shoot a video while in a U-Haul that makes a ton of noise and just assume that, you know, the sound will be great because you're gonna wing it. And 2, well, this romanticized idea of the road trip, of mobility, of actual movement, is directly tied in America with the idea of someone being able to progress, of having moral standing, of being worthwhile as a human being. So when someone's ability to physically move is hindered, either due to economic pressures, laws, or social issues like fear or hate crimes or anything like that, it shows us a lot about who America values and sees as being worthwhile. And so while the road trip is in many ways a perfect encapsulation of the ideals and beliefs of America, it's also a perfect encapsulation of the many flaws inherent in America itself, with giving access to many people to those beliefs and ideals. And in many ways, that dichotomy between American ideals and the open road reveals the issue at the heart of America. You see, America is always about moving to continue going. Just like in capitalism, which is built on constant growth. What a weird coincidence that. But growth and things like manifest destiny and roads do all eventually come to an end. But, you know, let's not end this on a bummer, because for all my talk about economic and social pressures and history, there is always a new road to find. We here in America can find a new path to go down. We can allow more people access to that mobility, to more roads, to more journeys. And also, that's where I find myself right now. This right here is my new apartment in Seattle. My road trip has finally ended, and one of my journeys is complete. But a new journey is before me, a new life here in Seattle. And it will probably be bumpy, it'll take me places I never thought I would go, and there will be roadblocks and places that are inaccessible to me because of who I am. And there's some places I may not even like to go that I have to go, but it's my road trip. And honestly, I'm privileged that I'm able to even have access to this trip, this journey at this part of my life. It's not something that everyone gets, especially in the United States. And so, again, I know I said this at the top of this video, but I want to thank all of you out there who are part of my audience in this community for helping me do this. And I also acknowledge for a moment that I am lucky. Lucky to have all of you, lucky to have this, and lucky to be me. But, you know, looking again at the grander scheme of everything, while America may not always give equal access to mobility, I still have to say there is something exciting about taking a journey. I understand the romance of the idea and why American ideals have all gotten caught up in it. There's a reason many of us love exploring new frontiers, to seek out new worlds, if I may allude to my, Trekkie nature. And it's also in many ways emblematic of life, of humanity. Our desire to learn, to see something, to find something new, to explore not only physical worlds, but the bounds of knowledge and what it means to exist. And so the open road in many ways is a metaphor for the human spirit. So here's to the open road ahead of me, but let us never forget that to forge ahead is also a privilege. And maybe we should all work harder to help more people move forward with us. But for now, here is where I end this journey and begin another one. Also, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And also, if you're coming in, please leave your shoes off at the doormat. Thanks. A huge thank you to my amazing patrons who make this channel happen, and an extra special thank you to Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Munir Amlani, John Steele, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Spock TOS, BBD, Nathan Olson, The Sir Spence, Zach Cody, Bree Beecher, Maeve, Chloe Dollar, Subraxis, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Tanya Trummer, Gretchen Badger, Dante St. James, Polly Mina, Piston Twisted Garage, Mark the Edge, and Din. I could not do this without all of you, so thank you so much, especially this month.